will be here on January 7th. He's a mentalist, and I've seen videos. He's quite amazing. Tickets are still available for Jim Stafford, which is on February 4th. And registration is happening now for our Willy Wonka Jr. and Jungle Book Kids, along with other classes through our education program, Studio Wayne. You can go to the Wayne Theater website and you can select education to see all that we have to offer. The last thing is, in February we have the Cirque Zuma Zuma, which is like an acrobatic act. So Happy New Year to you all, and thanks for supporting the Wayne. Now I'm gonna please welcome our speaker this evening, Dr. Joe Keiper.
Visible here. Okay, great. Well, welcome. Tonight, of course, first of all, let me introduce myself properly. My name is Joe Keiper. I am Curator of Invertebrates at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. Yay. No, actually, I'm not. That's how I used to introduce myself. Yes. Going into my past career, I was a museum curator, and I, as a young guy, really cut my teeth in the sciences working with aquatic insects. So this is kind of cool coming back. For those of you who don't know me properly, I'm Joe Keiper. The museum I work at is the Virginia Museum of Natural History, and while its main campus is 2.5 hours south of here in Martinsville, Virginia, we are now in the beginning phases of the detailed design for the branch campus that we are that we are going to build here, right in downtown Waynesboro. So I have great news. It was just last week that my CFO came to me and is like, the state has turned loose all the funds. So, yep, all right, so yeah, that's great stuff. So, and that's not just because, you know, yours truly here is a bug guy by training, right? But it's also that it's very important to stream ecosystems, and not only important to stream ecosystems, but also specifically to the South River, because something we're going to be focusing on with the South River is going to be the trout life cycle, because we have this cold waters ecosystem right at the bottom of the hill here. But these trout, they're predators on macroinvertebrates and other insects, so that just kind of makes for a very compelling story. But we'll probably also be working specifically on the life cycles of some of the insects, because one of the things that Waynesboro is known for is its angling, the fly fishing and so forth. And of course, anglers end up using the natural populations of insects that they find as models for the flies that they tie. So talk about insects, right? You know, first of all, it's great to have you all here in person, but we're also broadcast live, so to everyone out there in the internet beaming in today, I want to thank you for joining us as well. I'm going to ask some questions throughout and so forth. I'm sorry you won't be able to answer, but for those of you here, if I ask a question, just remember, I'm a very patient man. I always wait for at least one guess. If I don't get one guess, I can wait here for an hour, 2 hours. I just don't get tired. All right, yeah, exactly. So when I ask a question, it's best to have a guess, or we're here for a long time. So first of all, how many species of insect are known in the world?
Like around 1 million.
Around 1 million. Great guess. Does anyone want to add to that, or subtract that, or whatever?
I'd say a billion.
1 billion, right? Well, I will say that it is somewhere between 1 million and 1 billion, probably closer to 1 million. Right, so right now we have about, correct me if I'm wrong if you've heard something different, but last I looked, roughly 1.4 million named species of insect worldwide, right? But that's probably a little old. It could be a little bit more than that now. But that said, you know, the estimates as to what's really out there in nature range between 5 and 50 million. It probably ends up probably more towards the lower end is what people are thinking, but it's all just an estimate right now. In other words, we have no idea how many species of animal we share the planet with, right? So insects are extremely diverse. Now I can look at this, this is from a trap called a light trap. I can look at it, I can tell you that this is from a terrestrial situation, because I see some various moths and some terrestrial flies and a variety of other insects in there that would be very peculiar to terrestrial forest ecosystems. And what I don't see in here are some of the things that we're used to seeing around river systems like mayflies, stoneflies, caddisflies, and others. And we're going to introduce you to some of those. And so if we went and sampled within a stream, not just around the stream using some kind of device to attract adults in, we would actually be looking mainly at larval forms of insects and adults of some other kinds of invertebrates. So what we have here on the left at about 9 o'clock, we have a mayfly over there on the edge. So that's a larval mayfly that we can see swimming around the water, but mainly kind of clinging to rocks and so forth. If we look at around 12 o'clock towards the edge, that's a caddisfly. This is long worm-like body. We're going to talk about those as well. A group we won't really talk about is right in the center there, the big guy. That's called a scud, that's kind of a broad name applied to various kinds of crustaceans. So you know the roly-polies that you find underneath rocks and stuff? There's an aquatic version of that as well. They live solely underwater, right? And that's what that is. So that's one of the crustaceans. But we find that in river systems, we're talking mainly about the immatures of insects. And that's what I focused a lot on as a young guy. And if you go down to the South River during Riverfest, which, if I'm not mistaken, occurs in April, we'll be here for that. But if you go to Riverfest, you'll have a chance to jump in. And don't do it now, because you really don't want to stick your hand in the nice warm water tonight, right? It'll come back maybe slightly frozen. But nonetheless, in April will be a good time. That's what the instructors do, is they bring the kids down there, you roll up your pant legs and you jump in the stream, and you're kind of using these different nets and stuff, and you get all these things we call macro invertebrates. Macro because you can see them, and they're invertebrates because they are the evolutionarily superior organisms. They are not animals contaminated by backbones like you and me. They are the invertebrates, right? So the instructors at South River Fest will then show that to the children. It's a really fascinating exercise. And there's a lot we can learn from these things. We can learn about how streams function, and that's part of what we want to do tonight, is to understand kind of how streams function. So here's a picture of the South River, kind of nice up and close. If you're standing in the middle and you look down, you see all these rocks. When I look at these rocks, I see resources. I see many different kinds of resources. First of all, they're not just bare rocks. If you walked around them in your bare feet, you'd be sliding around a little bit because they're a bit slippery. They've got stuff growing on. We're going to talk about that stuff tonight. That's food. That's food for these invertebrates and other creatures as well, but the invertebrates really thrive on them. And there's more resources than that. I look, if the stream water from where we're sitting is flowing away from us, right? So I see the side of the rocks that are closest to us, where the water is striking the hardest, as a different resource than the rock on the leeward side, where the water is not flowing as heavily. I also see a different resource on top of the rock versus underneath the rock. The rock might be full of stuff growing on it on the surface that the insects need, but underneath there's no light that gets there, so nothing grows there. We're talking about photosynthetic organisms. So when I see this, I see different resources, and all of these resources are exploitable, and they are exploited by the invertebrates. So when we talk about insects tonight, when we go to look at them, if you take a general net and you drag it across the bottom, or use some of the techniques that the instructors show you how to use at South River Fest, right? That will just basically show you how many insects and other creatures you can get within a given area of the stream. But it doesn't tell you where they normally like to hang out. You've got to look really close for that. And we're going to be taking some close-up looks at some of these insects tonight. Let's talk about the life cycle of some of the common insects. There's two main kinds of life cycles. If we think about the insect life cycle, the basic insect life cycle is where you have an adult insect, such as the winged individual, that's not just to the right in the color picture, but in the drawing there, the female there laying eggs is at 3 o'clock on the chart. So you have the adult that lays eggs that hatch into larvae or nymphs, depending on how you use that term, and then those nymphs will eventually liberate an adult when they are mature. So that's the circular life cycle, and it can be an annual life cycle where insects, depending on the species, can have multiple generations during 1 year. So what we're missing here in this particular simple life cycle of a mayfly, right? Again, mayflies are very abundantly used by anglers. This is a caddisfly. It looks a bit like a moth, right? But it actually it has hairy wings rather than scaly wings. So if we look at the life cycle diagram, the drawing, the adult is down there at 6 o'clock, and she lays eggs in the water, so that's at 9 o'clock. And then we have the larva, but then, in this particular case, skip that little drawing there for a minute, I'm going to come back to that. But then what we have next is the pupal phase, the pupa, right? So that's different than the mayfly. The mayfly lacked a pupa. So in the mayfly life cycle, we're talking about an incomplete metamorphosis, as it's called. The change over time as the insect grows and it goes through its life cycle. It lacks the pupal phase, and it is called the incomplete life cycle because of that. So the larvae, or the nymph, looks a lot like the adult, but it lacks wings and it lacks other mature features. In the caddisfly, the larva, which is up there at around 10, 11 o'clock, it's very worm-like, you know, and it has this kind of head capsule, some legs sticking out of it and stuff like that. It doesn't look anything like the adult. There's this massive transformation or metamorphosis that occurs between the larval phase and the adult phase, and that's done with the pupa. So that's called the complete life cycle. So that's just something I'd like you to keep in mind. Now, why did I tell you to skip this structure here about 1 o'clock? Right, that's a case. We're going to talk more about these. These caddisflies are interesting individuals. They're all interesting, right? I can find something interesting about all of these. But I'm pretty biased towards caddisflies, and that's what I wrote my doctoral dissertation on way back when. So caddisflies are not just really neat insects unto themselves, and we're going to talk a little bit about their behavior, about their biology, and how they help streams function as we know them. But they're also architects. So in this particular situation, the larva is actually building using silk secreted from a gland by the mouth. It actually secretes this sticky silk, and in this case, it's taking little bits of rock out of the stream and creating a tube. The larva resides in and carries around that tube, and that tube itself, or what we technically call a case, the case itself has a number of different functions. It helps it blend in with its environment, so it's camouflage. It actually helps water circulate past the insect's body, the abdomen itself, helping it respire. And lastly, in a lot of cases, because they're very durable, they provide protection not only from predators, but from other things, such as if rocks start to shift during heavy flow, you know, it prevents the insect from being crushed. So this is just one example of the neat things that you can pick up in the insect world. So again, just wanted to come back to this. All these different kinds of insects and the different phases of the life cycle take place in the resources that we see here. The food resources, the space resources, and so forth. So what do we want to do today? We have 5 different objectives that I'd like you to engage in tonight. So first, just to develop an appreciation for what's underwater. If you've been to South River Fest and you've been down the creek and you've been with the instructors, you probably also have that appreciation, but maybe tonight you can do a little deeper dive. No pun intended. We want to introduce a topic to you that is going to be just a wealth of information that can inform our exhibits at the VMNH Waynesboro campus upcoming. My favorite question when I was a graduate student, even when I was a museum curator, is what are these things doing in nature? What is their role? And why do I bring this up? So we talked about 1.4 million named species of insect and who knows how many species of insect on the earth. Back in the day when I was talking to the experts, that is my instructors and other experts in the field when I was growing up as a fledgling entomologist, they always used this round number, which I eventually learned to grow that they just made up, right? It's that we maybe know the true biology, that is, what do they eat? Where do they mate? Where do they lay their eggs? What do the larvae eat? How do they mate? All these different things that we might want to understand about an insect. And they always said back then, they always said, we know maybe about the true biology of maybe about 10% of the species out there. And they waved their hand, you know, vaguely, right? 10%, right? And so I began to repeat that. And then I was like, wait a minute, we don't have an idea, probably not even within an order of magnitude of, you know, how many species we really understand the biology of. But let's just say 10% is approximately true, right? The problem is, that I've found, is that if you take a group of insects, say like a genus of insect, of which you might have 100 species in that genus. So, okay, that's fine. Now, maybe 2 or 3 of those species are going to be very common. That's typically what we see in the biological world. If you have big groups of organisms, just a few of those species are very common. The rest tend to be relatively rare. Which ones do we know the biology of? The common ones, right? Because they're easy to get, they're probably easier to raise in the laboratory than, you know, some of the more rare things and so forth. And I began to specialize on finding the rare ones and figuring out what they're doing. I'm like, hey, wait a minute, they don't behave exactly the way the common ones do. There are nuances, right? So that question there, what are these creatures doing in nature, is very important, because we really still, to this day here in the 21st century, only know what a very small proportion of the species that we share the planet with are doing what they're doing in nature. We just don't know that many of them. So I want you to grow an appreciation for complex behaviors. Now I will say I'm a little disappointed in myself because I had some technical issues, but I did have a few videos of some insect behavior, and if you're really interested, I can play them. I can fire up my computer after the talk and we can stand around it and I can show that to you. However, it doesn't matter. I can still articulate pretty well what these things are doing, right? But I want you to grow that appreciation for complex animal behavior. And lastly, again, making that pitch for Riverfest, I want to motivate you to learn more on your own, not just from reading or looking at YouTube videos and stuff, which we're all prone to do, but literally to walk that South River Greenway. And when the weather's good, put on a pair of muck boots, walk in the shallows, and pick up a rock and just see what you see, and start to ask some questions about what's in front of you. All right, let's get to the meat of the topics today. So basically, when we talk about insects, we talk about the larval stage or the adult stage mainly, right? So there's the pupal stage for those with the complete metamorphosis. We're just not going to dive into that tonight. The purpose of a larva, the immature stage of insects, is essentially they're feeding machines that grow and they are adapted to survive sometimes long period of times. There are not many, but there are relatively few insects whose larval stages literally last years. We all know about things like the 17-year cicada in terrestrial situations, and that's named because the larvae live for 17 years underground. Well, some of the dragonflies take upwards of 5 years locally to develop, right? So it's eating, it's growing, and it's surviving for long periods of time. Generally, with some exceptions being some of the more migratory species like monarchs or some of our dragonflies, they will live for a long period of time to support that migratory behavior. The adult will disperse because, well, that's what organisms do. They tend to disperse, and insects are good at that because so many of them have wings. So they're all also about mating, and therefore the female and her egg production. So those are the main purposes between a larva and an adult, right? Larvae, as we talk about the aquatic insects, we have a few things that seem obvious, but I still need to point them out. They're living underwater in a flowing environment, and they are they're surviving off of dissolved oxygen, mainly, right? We're going to see some exceptions later, right? But what we're talking about here are insects that breathe with gills the same way that fish do, right? The gills of fish and gills of insects are mechanically or morphologically a little bit different, but they still have the same purpose of absorbing dissolved oxygen from a stream, from the stream water, into their bodies for respiration. Whereas the adult tends to be terrestrial, breathing atmospheric air, and the only time they come back to the water is for the egg laying. In some cases, females like mayflies in that life cycle that we showed you, she'll fly over the water and dab her abdomen and scatter eggs into the water column. Whereas some of the caddisflies, it's really amazing if you get a chance to see this, they'll literally climb onto a rock, they'll land on a rock and climb down into the flowing water. And they got these hairy bodies that trap like a bubble of air around them, and it's almost like they're scuba divers. And they'll then go crawl under the rock and lay an egg mass and kind of put it on the underside. Different strategies along the way. For tonight, I mean, I've got like 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours worth of material here. So let's focus. Tonight we're going to talk about mainly the larval stage. So that is the immature stage. Not so much the biology of the eggs, not so much the pupa, but the larvae. It's what we encounter the most. It is what's functionally altering the stream ecosystem the most, and therefore it is something that we might consider the kind of most critical part of the insect life cycle as far as ecosystem function goes. All right, now here's the part, take a picture if you like, or I'm going to come back to each one of these different sections. But these are the main descriptors of insect feeding, particularly in flowing water systems. This translates over to standing water systems like lakes and ponds pretty well, but as far as streams go, this is what we're looking at. So the first kind of organism we look at is a scraper. Scrapers will live on those rocks that I showed that picture of that's got the stuff growing on it. That tends to be algae, right? Algae is photosynthetic microorganisms that grow adhering, in a lot of cases, to hard objects. And these scrapers are literally scraping that stuff off, and they're ingesting it. Collector-gatherers, it's a good term because it's self-explanatory. They're basically finding, they are finding and scavenging organic material in the stream itself and just ingesting about anything that it can engulf. Filter feeders, this is some pretty neat stuff. I can't wait to show you the photos and so forth. Filter feeders have different mechanisms to literally become a filtration system within the stream itself, and they're capturing particles out of the water column. We'll talk about how they do that and what those particles are. Shredders, they're hitting the autumnal leaf falls. So when we get all these leaves that fall into the stream or onto the terrestrial area and wash into a stream, that's a huge food and nutrient resource for streams. Shredders will attack those. Predators, self-explanatory, they're eating somebody else. And then kind of a more obscure one, but actually something I still want to bring up tonight because not only is it near and dear to my heart, I did a lot of work with these so-called piercer herbivores. They tend to be overlooked in streams, mainly because they're extremely small, but doesn't matter they're very small, they're hugely abundant. When I did my doctoral dissertation working with piercer herbivores, I worked in this little stream where there was some open canopies, so we had nice blooms of algae in this space here, and I found up to 10,000 individuals per meter squared. So an area about this big, right, you got 10,000 individuals crawling there doing it and eating like day and night. So they are an important part of that stream ecosystem and many others. So I'm going to bring it up tonight. Speaker's prerogative. All right, so here's a mayfly, right? So this is one of my videos, but I'm still going to, I'm not going to play the video, I'll still kind of show it to you here. Right, so this is a little guy about 6 millimeters long. Right, I kind of threw him down in a pan here, a contrasting pan, so you can see what he looks like. These are extremely abundant. They're called flat-headed mayflies. What I want you to notice in this picture, notice where his legs are. They're splayed out to the side. They're not underneath of him like your dog or cat, right? They're splayed out to the side, so it's basically belly crawling wherever it goes. In the next picture that I'll show you, you'll also see that the head is very flat. That's the name flat-headed mayfly, and they push themselves down up against whatever they're crawling on. Notice the 3 tails. Those tails, the technical term for them are circi. These circi, they splay out that way, and they actually act as sort of a rudder and help the insect maintain stability in flowing water, right? So that's the morphology of this thing, and this thing comes right out of the South River right here. Here's a diagram on the left and a kind of enlarged photo on the right. So what I want you to notice again, on the right-hand side, facing upwards, you see this guy's front, it kind of has this curved structure. He literally pushes that down on the substrates that they crawl on. They crawl on our rocks, right? So this is going to be one of our scrapers. The mandibles are hidden underneath the head there. You can see the eye spots. They're not really visual organisms. They don't see like you and I do. It's more like they see kind of a mosaic of patterns to help them figure out up from down and front and back, right? And to see movement. For like say predator avoidance or something, but the flat head is pressed down against this rock substrate, and it will use these mandibles that scrape against the rock, and they will pull the algae growing on that rock into their mouth, and that is how they feed. And so what you'll also notice on the side, look at the drawing there, you see there kind of about midway, there's a little diagram that shows that those feathery things on the side of the abdomen, the hind part of the body, are gills. So they're highly adapted to flowing water ecosystems, absorbing dissolved oxygen out of the water column. So again, if we look at this, all that green stuff on there is different forms of algae. If you picked up one of those rocks, and we'll see a close-up momentarily, you're going to see that some of these algae, these photosynthetic organisms, or photosynthetic creatures, they're almost like plants, but they're a different kingdom than plants. But what they do is they'll grow in filaments off of the rocks, so they attach very closely to the rocks. But then there's others that kind of create a coating, and that's what gives the rock that slimy feel. And so they're literally scraping that stuff day and night. So if you went and you got like a razor blade and you scraped off some of that material off of the surface of the rock, and you scraped it on a microscope slide and you put it down underneath the microscope, this is what you'd see. Looks like a bunch of little glass structures. And that's kind of what it is. So these individual shapes that you see here are what are called diatoms. Diatoms are these algae that are single-celled. They grow attached to rocks and other hard substrates underwater. And what's important about them is that kind of glass-looking structure on the outside is literally silica. It's what we call a silica frustule that actually holds the organism inside of it. And so the insects will scrape these things. Scrapers are chronically scraping these diatoms, and why they're important is because these diatoms are full of what we call lipids or fats. And as you know, in the animal kingdom, that's something that's always sought after, because that's high energy, that is high yield in terms of energy production for growth, and a lot of nutrition in there for the insects as well. So that's what they're going after, is these diatoms and the other things growing on the surface of the rock. This is a dissection of a flat-headed mayfly, but I want you to look at diagrams D and E in the upper right. These are going to be reversed, so the D is the right mandible and E is the left mandible, because you're looking at them from the underside of the creature. And what you see here, they're very flattened, almost like a couple of knives that are literally pushed up against the rock and scraping that material off of the substrate for them to ingest. And you may notice towards the top there, they have these kind of brushes and so forth that help to push the scraped material into the mouth. So very highly adapted, and scrapers generally, of different kinds of insects, generally have the same kind of mouth structure, this mandible structure. So we see that as very conserved amongst scrapers. Very common, very highly adapted to their environment. Now, since we're talking about the flat-headed mayfly, we're going to do a little bit of kind of math here, right? So I don't have too many charts like this, but we're going to show you this one here. Let's clear this graph real quick. On the left-hand side, we have the depth of the water. So at 200 up at the top, that's 200 centimeters, or about 6 feet deep, right, down all the way to the bottom, or 0. So that's depth of the water. From left to right, we have increasing velocity of flow. Increasing velocity of flow from approximately 150 millimeters per second over to the right. The highest value is around 240. Notice at the surface of the water's a little slower, just a tad slower than just below the surface. Anyone want to guess why that is? This is true of all flowing water.
Surface tension.
Surface tension is a great thought, Irby, and that is part of the story. Anyone want to throw anything more into that? You know, surface tension, that's, you know, water is wet for a reason because the way the molecules are arranged, and water is sticky, so when you touch when you touch water, you pull your finger off, a drop sticks to the bottom of your finger, water's sticky.
Friction with the air.
Friction with the air, exactly, right? So as water flows on the surface, it's hitting the atmosphere, and it naturally has a bit of drag. But as you move down just a little bit below the surface, you begin to get increased flow. And then the closer you get to the bottom, the same thing happens. The closer you get to the bottom, the more friction with the bottom of the river that you have. The more friction with the rocks. And when you get all the way down to the bottom, this graph doesn't go quite down to the bottom. It goes to about maybe 10 or so centimeters above the rocks. But you can use different tools, like there's one called a micropitot tube that you can actually put all the way down up against the surface of rocks, and you can measure velocity of the water there. And what they find is that this flow of the water up against the rock literally goes down to almost 0. And that's what we call the boundary layer. The boundary layer is between the flow of the water and the surface of the rock. And why is that important? When you're a flat-headed mayfly or any other number of aquatic insects, you have adaptations about your head, about your body, about your behavior, that you're pressed so close to that rock, you're literally living in that boundary zone. So when the water speeds up because of flooding or something like that, you're out of the flow. You're not going to get washed away. When things get so turbulent, the rocks are being pushed and tumbled and stuff, that's different, right? Then you get what's called scouring. Insects are good at letting go and going downstream when they feel they have no other choice, right? And they'll end up settling somewhere else. But insects, these aquatic insects, are awesome at remaining in place, and they will literally sit on the surface of those rocks as long as a predator doesn't bother them, and they're literally mowing the lawn, going back and forth and scraping that algae growing, adhering to the surface there. So that boundary layer, there's one thing you want to bring to the cocktail party, the next cocktail party you attend, talk about the boundary layer, right? You can even demonstrate. You can get down on the floor real flat and be like, if I were an aquatic insect, and people will be very impressed, believe me. I want to tell you about another scraper. So this is one of my Microcaddisflies, and one that I worked with. This is an unusual one. First of all, let's clear the slide. On the left-hand side, we've got a rock. Notice it's discolored. The rock is maybe kind of a yellowish brown if it were completely barren of any kind of biological material. But that stuff that gives it that kind of greenish tinge, the dirty tinge, that's mainly going to be algae. It's going to be diatoms and whatnot. And then you see some of the stuff gets a little fuzzy looking. You think maybe it's moss. It's not moss. It's filamentous algae. And we'll come back to filamentous algae later in the talk. we're more interested in the diatoms and so forth. So you see there that kind of clear area in the middle of the rock of the left-hand image, but you got those two buttons sitting there. Those two little buttons are actually cases built by Caddisflies. Remember I mentioned at the beginning they're good at being architects, right? So this particular Microcaddisfly, he's about 5 millimeters long. He's not very long. You see this kind of worm-like creature with this big abdomen towards the bottom here, right? What he does is he uses those that silk gland near the mouth, and he spins, like literally weaves a structure that is so tight. It is just a wonderful, just beautiful piece of architecture. It's got openings at both ends, and he begins to eat by sticking his head and legs out of that case and starts to scrape the algae off of the rock there, and then pulls his head back in and then digests, sticks his head back out, eats some more, pulls back in and digests. His abdomen gets so big he'll never leave that case. He will never leave because he's too big to get out of either end. But he has to have those ends to exit to eat, to have water to flow through for respiration, for the dissolved oxygen, but also to get rid of waste materials while he's eating. So now what's incredible here is that when you get, this is just two individuals kind of next to each other. If you get a rock that's highly densely packed with these larvae, it could be like, you get like 50 of them on one rock. They evenly space themselves apart. They're very cooperative. They don't want to compete with one another. And what's crazy is they'll eat, and then once they finish the algae that's growing around the case, they'll actually retract within the case and wait a few days as the algae grows back, and then go back out and start to eat again. And so if you go out there now, I just picked this guy out of the river a few weeks ago. If you go out there now, and you roll up your pant legs and you walk out into the river and you put your ear down, you'll hear, and that's them scraping the algae off the rocks. No, I'm kidding. You can't really hear them. They're very small, right? And there's a lot of noise from the flowing water and whatnot. But what's also cool is when they are waiting for those diatoms to grow back and dirty up the rocks so they can mow the lawn and eat more, sometimes you get obnoxious filaments of algae that they can't digest. Not all algae are equal. There's thousands of different kinds of algae, and not all are digestible by these guys. And when they'll actually go out and inspect their lawn, and when they find that there are some of these filaments of algae growing next to their case, they literally nibble on the end of it till it floats away in the water. So they're weeding. They're virtually creating an agro-ecosystem. So that's some of the behavior that they do. So it's not just the feeding itself, but it's the maintaining of the area around them. Let's move along. So this was a video. This is actually a case that's adhering very closely to a rock. So again, you kind of see that same strategy here. This is a different kind of caddisfly. I got a better picture of her. Oop, no, I don't. Thought I did. So this is, you can see this kind of bark-shaped, bark composite case that this caddisfly of the family Brachycentridae does not have a good common name, sorry to say. But in this picture, what the video would have shown is I stick my big finger down there and try to pick him off, and it's not easy because he's actually attached. So after he grows his case and he crawls around to a place that he likes, he'll temporarily attach his case to that rock and graze a little bit and hang there for a while until he's depleted everything and move along, reattach his case and eat. So more behavior.
So they come in and out of the cases?
The question is, do they come in and out of the cases? No. In this particular situation with the Microcaddisfly, he's in there forever. That's a fixed retreat, so he doesn't carry it around. With this particular individual here, this is a portable case, so they carry it around in their abdomen, but they can temporarily attach it to a rock so they're in a stable position to feed for a while, a day or so, and then they cut the line or cut the string, and they will move along to another spot where there is abundant algae to feed on. So a little different behavior there, a little different strategy. Right? So before we move on to the next group of organisms, I want to talk about the riffle pool alternation. If you go to a natural stream, not one that's been modified with dams or erosion control structures or has been channelized or anything like that, if you have a naturally occurring stream, you get what's called a riffle pool alternation. And I don't know why, maybe somebody else knows why, but a riffle is an area where you have shallow water with a lot of rocks or what we call coarse material. The water flows over and creates like a rapids, a lot of turbulence, and that aerates the water. There's high oxygen in the riffle. But then you alternate to a pool, and the pool is deeper, it's slower, and instead of having a rocky bottom, you tend to have more like sediments and stuff, like silts. and whatnot. Two completely different sorts of aquatic ecosystems right next to each other. And the riffle pool alternation occurs about once every 5 to 7 times the width of a stream. Why mathematically that comes out that way, I have never learned, never been able to figure it out. It was first published in a 1950s book by a kind of an early proponent of stream ecology, and he figured that out. He went out and measured a bunch of streams, and he was like, oh yeah, 5 to 7 widths of a stream, you're going to change from a riffle to a pool. So that's kind of a neat pattern there that we see in nature. Most of the insects are going to be feeding within the riffle. They're going to be hanging out there. There's more abundant habitat with the rocks creating complexity. In the pool, you get lower oxygen. You get the sediments and stuff. The sediments are difficult to stay stable in. But there are insects there. So it's different. Just a matter of maybe 10, 20 feet within a stream, you get a completely different set of insects and a completely different set of feeding habits. In that pool area, where you have this very fine sediment and stuff like that, you get things like these bloodworms. Bloodworms are part of a huge group of insects. They're known as chironomids, or more commonly known as midges, right? So they look a little bit like a mosquito. Here's the adult on the right, but notice no long mouth parts sticking out to stick you with and draw your blood, right? So the adults are non-feeding. They're very important fish and bird food, amongst other organisms. The bloodworm is something that lives down in those sediments, but the sediments have very, very, very low oxygen. And so how can it respire down there? Well, it's one of the few kinds of insects that actually incorporate hemoglobin within their blood, right? So we have hemoglobin, right? It's what actually carries oxygen within our bloodstream and is part of our circulatory system. That's something that's relatively rare within the insect kingdom, or I'm sorry, the insect kingdom. And you end up with just a few, such as these bloodworms that are very common. You can find them right here in the South River. They're going to live within these areas of very low oxygen because the hemocoel gives them an advantage. And they're a collector-gatherer. So again, this is the one that's basically finding scavenged materials that it can kind of pull to itself, and it's not picky at all. It will feed upon a dead or dying insect. It will feed on some rotten leaves. It will feed on things that who knows what it is, senescing algae or whatever. So they're going to be kind of the cleanup crew within our streams. And so there isn't really a lot, that we can say that's going to differentiate the behavior of one kind of collector-gatherer from another. There's lots of different species that do this. It's one of the very common feeding habits that we find in rivers, but this cleanup crew all has the same strategy of basically gathering the materials together that it wants to consume. But let's move on to something that's a little more complex. This is neat stuff. These are the filter feeders. So as I mentioned, there are various kinds of insect that utilize filtering apparatus to capture materials in the water column. On the left-hand side, we're going back to another caddisfly. These are known as the Hydrocychidae, or again, not a very good common name that we have for them. But what you notice is it builds a fixed retreat. These things are about maybe 6 or 7 millimeters long, maybe upwards of a centimeter in big species. And so what we have here is they build this little retreat that they hide in. The retreat is permanently fixed to a rock, oftentimes on the back side or even the underside of a rock. But notice that it spins a web, it spins a net. And literally what it does is it lets water pass through this netting and find particulate organic bits of material will stick to that net. And then what it does every so often is, again, if you roll up your sleeves and you go to the South River and you stick your ear down to it, you just hear nom, 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 nom. Well, that's the hydrocychids. Now, they don't really make that sound, right? They don't. But nonetheless, what they're doing is they literally eat the caked up material that's on the net and the net itself, and they recycle that webbing that they've used, right? So that's one strategy. On the right-hand side, we have a thing called a black fly, right? So we've heard about black flies. They're a biting insect. The female needs a blood meal to make eggs. The larvae live underwater, and believe it or not, those kind of weird fan-looking structures, what we call a cephalic fan, cephalic referring to the head, right? This is a modified mouth part that actually creates a very fine device to capture materials with. So again, the hydrocychid, here's the larva that lives inside the case. And the head is on the left there, and you can see the thorax, the 3 thoracic segments with the legs kind of hanging off of it. It uses that to move in and out of the case as need be to provide maintenance, and it also uses those legs to then retract the netting and consume it so they can feed. Then you have the abdomen, right? Look all the way at the tip of the abdomen. On the right-hand side, you see those hooks that allows it to hook itself within its case. They're very difficult to extract from those cases. And then lastly, on the underside of the abdomen, you see those feathery structures. Again, as we talked about before, those are gills, allow it to survive in streams and the areas of low oxygen if need be, but they'll also be very well present within riffles where there's a lot of oxygen. So I hope you're kind of understanding here that if you find an area of a stream where it's a lot of bloodworms and a lot of these hydropsychic caddisflies with all these gills, it's probably an area you don't have good water quality. Maybe you have some sewage pollution or something that's actually reducing the oxygen in the stream, but it's still, you're finding a lot of these bloodworms and hydropsychic caddisflies, right? What you're really looking for if you want a healthy stream is going to be this rough diversity of insects, including the ways in which they respire. So the presence of these by themselves doesn't mean you have bad water quality. The presence of these in the absence of lots of other kinds of insects indicates maybe you don't have good water quality. But they are still very fascinating in their behavior, and they're just wonderful natural architects. Getting back to the black fly, here's a whole organism picture. So on the left you have the head, you see those two phallic fans. Those fans are so fine, they can literally put them out into the water column and they can actually capture bacteria. Bacteria will stick to it. So they're capturing algae, bacteria. They're even capturing things like broken up bits of leaf and dying algal cells and stuff like that. So they're eating a little bit of everything. And so is the caddisfly. It's capturing anything it can within that net and eating it. But the phallic fans, it literally just retracts periodically, kind of, they don't have a tongue, but they virtually almost like lick them off or scrape them off and put them back out there. And they're doing that 24/7. So again, going back to what larvae do, they eat and they grow and they survive, and black flies do that very well. So filter feeders are really neat in their ability to capture materials out of the environment. Oops, getting ahead of myself here. All right, so you may remember from, this last science talk, or was the one before that, we had our expert in mussels. Did anyone see that talk? Right, I think a couple of you did, right? So we had a good appreciation for mussels, these clams that grow within stream ecosystems, and they tend to be very large, about this big. These are our native mussels, or called the unionid mussels. What we find locally here, if you go down to the riverbanks, you can find these little Asian clams. They're non-native, right? But you can see they have these heavily ridged shells like you see up there at about 12 o'clock on the screen, right? So they're filter feeders too, just like the mussels from the last science talk, right? So there as well, I wanted to throw those in there just to kind of connect back to that last talk that mussels and clams are important filter feeders as well. All right, let's move on to the shredders. Now, last month I could go out into the stream and I could find these in abundance, and I call these leaf packs, right? So no mystery here. You get all these leaves that have to come off the trees in the fall, and they get washed down or blown down into streams, and they accumulate like this. They get stuck between rocks in the riffle or in a branch that's fallen into the water or anything along those lines. So they can get pretty thick, but they're an amazing resource. And there are insects that suddenly become very numerous and grow very quickly when leaf packs become available. Now, a dead leaf, when you think about it, and I challenge you to do this, dead leaves are very difficult to live off of. Try it for a week, right? You won't do very well. Nah, don't do that, right? But there are insects that's all they feed on. And so there's a couple of important reasons for that, but let's think about this dead leaf. When they fall into the water, they're basically going to sit there for a while before the insects are ready to feed them. They become conditioned naturally. Just like the rocks become coated with algae and microbes and so forth, so do the leaves. We think about leaves, these dead leaves in stream ecosystems, like peanut butter and crackers. You don't get a lot out of the crackers, it's the peanut butter that you're after. That's where your nutrition and flavor and everything else is. It's the same way with leaves. These leaves become conditioned with algae, bacteria, fungi, other microbes, and it becomes this rich food source. And there are various kinds of shredders, such as these crane fly larvae. All right, so these crane flies, again, kind of look a little bit superficially like mosquitoes. This is the giant crane fly, Tipula abdominalis. It's all over the place. You can find them in the South River and smaller streams as well. And this fly larva literally has these big mandibles that literally crunch up the leaves. They swallow everything whole. And in doing so, they're really digesting the microbes. Now let's also think about this. They're not only feeding and growing and surviving, they're processing those leaves. So one, the literal process of eating the leaves makes them smaller, reduces their size, it breaks it up. And then filter feeders and collector gatherers downstream are cleaning up the mess, right? So none of this goes to waste. The other thing too, when these various insects excrete, a lot of that becomes a food source for other insects downstream. So nothing goes to waste here. There's always resources available for insects, and they come in all different kinds. And so these crane flies and other shredders in the autumn are incredibly important for processing these leaf packs, and therefore releasing or liberating the nutrients and food resources so they can be available for other organisms as well, some of which are extremely important up the food chain. Okay. So this is one of the really kind of neat shredders we can find in stream. Now this is big, right? So you can see the crane flies, pretty close to the width of the palm of the person's hand here. The larva is big and chunky too. It gets to be a couple inches long, but fortunately quite harmless. There are some that are smaller. Right now, being that it's January, even in frozen days, you can get winter stone flies, right? Some of the few insects that actually fly in the snowpacks and so forth. Down on the bottom left is a larva. The larvae are shredders, and up top we have an adult, and they have various kinds of antifreeze within their blood that actually allow them to operate in the terrestrial system as a winged adult during the winter. And this is an adaptation we call hiding in time. Think about the main insectivores, like insectivorous birds. Think about your warblers and flycatchers and things. They've all migrated south. There's not a lot out looking around for insects for a meal. But things like winter crane flies, winter stone flies, winter caddisflies, and a few other things, they're actually out in some abundance, and it's really interesting. So if you get a snowfall here by the South River, go walk the greenway and look close. They're only, they're going to be less than a half-inch long, right? But they're out there. Now what's interesting too is they actually selectively feed on these leaves. So here's a cottonwood leaf, and these winter stone flies will feed in this way and skeletonize leaves. Leaves aren't all equal in the streams. Things like oak and hickory, they're very tough, right? They're what we call recalcitrant. They're hard to break down, even if they're conditioned by microbes, right? So that's kind of a hard cracker to eat, right? The insects actually will selectively work on things like maple and poplar first because they're much easier to eat. But interestingly, these insects will not waste their time trying to gnaw on the very heavy veins, which are just like cellulose and not a lot of nutrition there. So they kind of selectively feed on that, which is pretty cool. I like that. I'm not going to spend much time on predators to save a little time. There's really not much to say, except that you've got some really fierce predators out there. You've got such as this predatory stone fly. He measures almost an inch long, and you can see here in this cool picture that a colleague of mine took, it's actually devouring a mayfly. Whereas in the bottom picture, taken by another colleague, you have a Helgermite larva, right? Helgermites are a favored bait for anglers, not to catch anglers. Anglers use Helgermites to catch fish with, right? But you see here this fierce predator, which can get quite large, maybe upwards of like 2 or more inches long, and it can actually give you quite a pinch. If you catch a really big Helgermite out in nature and stuff like that, it might just about draw blood. But you can see here it's eaten one of these predatory stone flies unto itself. So they're out there, they're kind of top of the food chain before fish. Just wanted to throw this in here. So we have the predators covered in these functional feeding groups. The last group I'll talk about are these Microcaddisflies that I study that eat algae. Now and in particular filamentous algae. So basically, over the years as I grew up, we talked about terrestrial insects and their diversity. Now what drove terrestrial insect diversity was the flowering plants. When flowering plants evolved on Earth and they diversified, suddenly all these different food resources become available because plants are all different chemically, and so you have insects that adapt to become specialists feeding on just one plant or just a few plants or many plants. Lots of different strategies there. But in streams it was like, you eat algae or you don't eat algae. What's the difference, right? It's, if you got algae and you like to eat algae, you'll eat algae. Well, we found that that's not true. They can be really selective. So this is Clidofera here on the side here. It's a very common green algae. If you go out by a stream or even a lake and you see a rock in the moving water, it looks like it has a green wig on it, right? More than likely, that's going to be Clidofera. It's a really abundant alga. right? You can see here in this microscopic view here, you can see how these individual threads of algae are actually divided up by individual cells. And these Microcaddisflies, which are very small, that's the name, they literally crawl up on these individual threads, and they almost have like Swiss Army knives for mouth parts, and they punch holes in the algae, and the algal cell itself has pressure inside of it, and you can watch underneath the microscope as the contents, the photosynthetic contents, which is its lunch, will literally shoot out of the hole into the mouth of the larva. And that's how they do it. Some even have adapted a means of, I don't know how they do it, it's kind of interesting because they don't, insects don't have lungs and a diaphragm like we do, and we can take a deep breath, or we can actually slurp a straw, right? I don't know how they do it, but I've watched as they can actually somehow create a negative pressure, and they're literally drawing the photosynthetic material out of the individual cells. So, but what was interesting, again, was we found some selectivity. So algae just as an algae to insects, that's what we thought when I grew up as a beginning student, but when I was completing my dissertation work, I was like, nah, that's not true. I could give these guys the wrong algae, I could try to fake them out, and I feed them all day on the right alga, and then I'll like slip the wrong one in without telling them, right? You literally watch as they grab it and they bring it to their mouth parts, and they literally like reject it. You can actually see them kind of push it away, like they know something's up, right? So there's some parallels between the evolution of algae, the subsequent evolution of these Microcaddisflies and other algae feeders, parallel to what we see with terrestrial systems and these flowering plants millions of years ago that drove insect diversity over time. So these are just fascinating behaviors. These functional feeding groups, I think really illustrate nicely some real hooks to get people fascinated by wanting to understand insects even more. So in streams, let me go back. In streams, all different streams, they have different communities, and that goes back to the functional feeding groups. On the left-hand side, we have a spring creek. It's heavily shaded. You're not going to get a lot of algae or any of those primary producers in there. Scrapers, piercer herbivores are not really going to be in abundance there. But with all those leaves that fall in there, shredders are going to be big, right? On the other hand, you move to kind of a more mid-sized stream where you have an open canopy. The functional feeding groups change because the nature of the ecosystem changes, right? And then we move up to the largest rivers. So where is this? Can anyone figure it out from the slide?
Harper's Ferry.
Who said that? Who said Harper's Ferry? Good for you. That's awesome. All right, Harper's Ferry. Yes, Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. You've got the Shenandoah River on the left, the Potomac River on the right. The Potomac's the larger one, takes priority, so it all becomes the Potomac at the bottom, flows towards Washington, D.C. and the Chesapeake Bay. When you get these giant rivers, everything changes. Everything is silty. You really don't get these riffles. Scrapers and piercer herbivores are relatively rare. You do get leaf input and stuff like that, but really what you're talking about is a lot of silty habitat and a lot of collector-gatherers and some predators and so forth, right? So between these small streams, these mid-sized and these large-sized streams, the functioning of the insects and their contributions to the environment change dramatically. Now just a couple of bits of final lessons here. This is basically a stream order diagram. So when we have small streams, such as a stream that forms just from a spring seepage out of a hillside, we call that a first order stream because it's all by itself. When you have two first order streams come together, they form what we call a second order stream. When two second order streams come together, they form a third order stream and so forth, all the way up to 12th order. So something like the Nile or the Amazon are 12th order streams. Just in this diagram, I hope you'll notice too, sort of in the center, where a third and a first come together, nothing changes. What the result of that combination is still a third order and so forth. So all of Earth's rivers can be categorized as either stream order 1, stream order 12, or somewhere in between. The Nile, indeed. And so here's kind of a diagram. If you're sitting in the back, you have to squint a bit, but you still get the idea. The idea here is that in first order streams, shredders, collector-gatherers, filter feeders, and predators are highly abundant. They do very well in there because of the nature of the resources that are available to them. Because of the canopy, scrapers and piercer herbivores don't do well. Move to kind of the more mid-order streams, what we find is that the scrapers and the piercer herbivores become abundant because there's a lot of photosynthesis because of sunlight getting into the stream. Shredders and filter feeders are still abundant. Oh, and collector-gatherers and predators are as well. And we generally find that mid-order streams like the South River are going to be some of your more diverse streams in terms of different kinds of functional feeding groups. When you get up to some of the bigger rivers, 7+ and so forth, you got collector-gatherers down in the sediment that they support. Filter feeders still do particularly well. Predators are always there. But then things like shredders, they're there, so they get kind of a little smaller font, but then the real small font are the scrapers and the piercer herbivores. So as we change the nature of the stream, we change the nature of the resources, we change the nature of the insect community that is present. And so lastly, when we talk about functional feeding groups and microbes, they're driving that. So they're feeding on the leaves, they're feeding on the algae, they're feeding on the other resources that fall into the creek or grow in the creeks and the rivers, and they're processing that. Their waste products that result from their sloppy feeding to things that they excrete create more resources downstream for other organisms, and that includes the microbial ecosystem. And we get what's called nutrient cycling that continues on down the stream. Things just don't wash, from Harper's Ferry all the way to Chesapeake Bay. They're used and reused multiple times, and insects and their behavior are driving that. In a lot of cases, we talk about wetlands on the edges of rivers, such as swamps and so forth, that become flooded, become the kidneys of ecosystems, of stream ecosystems. Wetlands are filtering out a lot of contaminants and so forth, and I think it's a pretty good analogy. Personally, I also like to consider that the functional feeding groups, including the microbes they live with, are the digestive system of our rivers. So when you get down to South River Fest, try to look at it through the lens of these functional feeding groups and try to ask that question: what are these things doing? Don't just be satisfied with knowing, hey, that's a flat-headed mayfly, or that's a beaded, mayfly, or that's an Asian dragonfly. You can put names on it. Names are great. We got to have names to communicate with one another. But ask that question: what are they doing in nature? And I encourage you to learn more. So with that, I'm at about an hour, so I'm going to go ahead and call it quits. I'll answer a few questions for the group now, but I will be glad to stick around and answer some questions one-on-one. In the back, please.
So I received a thing from Waynesboro about the leaf gathering process that they go through. One of the statements in there is they're trying to keep the leaves out of the river.
Okay, what we have here in Waynesboro is we're going to have an urban ecosystem. So most of what I'm talking about is going to be what we talk about in a naturally occurring ecosystem. So in a lot of cases in urban areas, you get what you get. You got roads all the way to the river, you got sidewalks all the way to the river, you got mowing all the way to the river, and so you can get this large influx of everything from fertilizer to lawn clippings to an easy opportunity for leaves to be blown into the river, or for property owners to be like, well, in my neighborhood I don't have a river, so people blow them out into the road, so when I ride my bike I can slide on and fall down. So, we try to discourage that. And the same thing should go for the river. You don't want to overdo it and choke it up. So that way you're creating an unnatural situation where you're creating kind of a smothering function on the bottom. That's one of the big things that we have in as far as conservation of rivers, is smothering of the bottom, the benthic areas we call it, where their eggs are being laid and the larvae are developing, because where we have maybe like logging or agriculture that isn't managed properly, and you get siltation in there, you get this smothering. Leaves can be the same thing if you start to overdo it. So, but excellent point. Anybody else? Alrighty, well, that's been about an hour. I want to thank you all for this. We got a couple of more talks upcoming right here at the Wayne Theater. So try to show up for those as well. It's been a great series of speakers so far. So keep your eyes out for further announcements on the branch campus. And again, if any of you have any specific one-on-one questions, I'd be glad to stick around and chit-chat a little bit about those. But otherwise, thanks again for all your support, and thanks for coming out tonight.